Sarah Mitchell adjusted her window seat and smiled at the flight attendant offering coffee. At 34, she had taken countless flights during her military career, but now as a civilian consultant, air travel felt different, more relaxed, more ordinary. She pulled out her laptop, planning to review some technical reports during the 5-hour flight from Denver to Miami. The Boeing 737 was packed with vacation travelers and business passengers. Families chatted excitedly about their destinations while business people typed away on their devices. Sarah noticed the young mother across the aisle struggling with her crying baby and offered a warm smile. The woman looked exhausted, probably dreading the long flight ahead. Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez completed their pre-flight checks in the cockpit. Both experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours between them. They expected a routine journey. The weather reports showed clear skies most of the way, with only minor turbulence possible over the Rocky Mountains. Johnson, 52, had been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 2 decades. Martinez, newer to the profession at 28, was eager and thorough in his procedures. Sarah closed her eyes as the plane taxied toward the runway. She had developed a habit of meditation before takeoff, a practice that helped her transition from her high-stress military background to civilian life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister wishing her safe travels. Sarah typed back quickly before switching to airplane mode. The engines roared to life as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of liftoff, watching Denver shrink below through her window. The city looked peaceful from this height, with its geometric patterns of streets and the majestic Rocky Mountains forming a dramatic backdrop. She had always loved this moment of departure, the brief pause between one life and another. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah noticed the elderly gentleman next to her reading a war memoir. He introduced himself as Harold, a veteran from Korea. They began discussing military history, and Sarah found herself sharing some of her own experiences, though she kept the details vague. She had learned to be careful about revealing too much about her background in casual conversations. The flight attendants began their service, moving efficiently through the cabin with drinks and snacks. Sarah accepted a coffee and returned to her laptop, reviewing technical specifications for a new navigation system she was consulting on. Her military experience in avionics and aircraft systems had translated well into civilian consulting work, though she sometimes missed the intensity and purpose of her previous career. About an hour into the flight, Sarah noticed something subtle that most passengers would miss. The plane's engine sound had changed slightly, becoming less smooth than before. Her trained ear picked up the irregularity immediately. She looked out the window but saw nothing unusual. The change was so minor that even the other passengers seemed unaware, continuing their conversations and activities normally. Sarah debated whether to mention anything to the flight crew. In her military days, she would have investigated immediately, but as a passenger, she felt uncertain about her role. She decided to wait and monitor the situation, trusting that the pilots would notice any significant issues. Her military training had taught her to observe first, act second. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a routine announcement about reaching cruising altitude and expected arrival time. His tone was calm and professional, giving no indication of any problems. Sarah relaxed slightly, thinking perhaps she had been overly sensitive to normal aircraft sounds. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Johnson was reviewing some unusual readings on his instruments. The engine parameters were within normal ranges, but something felt different. He mentioned his concerns to Martinez, who double-checked the systems. Everything appeared normal on paper, but both pilots had learned to trust their instincts as much as their instruments. Sarah struck up a conversation with Harold about his service in Korea. He described the challenges of operating equipment in harsh conditions and how soldiers had to improvise solutions when technology failed. His stories reminded Sarah of her own experiences dealing with aircraft emergencies in remote locations, where quick thinking and technical knowledge often meant the difference between mission success and failure. The plane encountered some light turbulence over the mountains, nothing unusual for this route. Most passengers barely noticed, but Sarah felt the aircraft's response seemed slightly off. The way it handled the air currents suggested something might be affecting its normal flight characteristics. She found herself unconsciously analyzing the plane's behavior, her military training impossible to completely switch off. A businessman across the aisle was complaining loudly about the Wi-Fi connection, apparently missing an important video conference. Sarah smiled to herself, thinking about how different priorities could be depending on your perspective. She had once flown missions where communication blackouts lasted for days, making a few hours without internet seem trivial by comparison. The flight attendants continued their professional service, but Sarah noticed one of them, Jennifer, seemed slightly more attentive than usual. She was checking with the cockpit more frequently and scanning the cabin with what appeared to be trained awareness. Sarah wondered if the crew had noticed something as well, or if she was reading too much into normal procedures. As the plane continued its journey, Sarah found herself caught between her civilian passenger role and her deeply ingrained military instincts. She had spent years developing expertise in aircraft systems and emergency procedures, but now she was supposed to simply trust others to handle any problems. The internal conflict felt strange after so many years of taking charge in critical situations. The peaceful flight continued, with most passengers settling into their routines of reading, sleeping, or working. Children played games while their parents relaxed. Business travelers typed on laptops, and elderly passengers dozed quietly. None of them suspected that their journey might soon require skills that only one person on the plane possessed, skills that Sarah hoped would never be needed, but had trained her entire career to use when lives depended on making the right decisions under pressure. 2 hours into the flight, the subtle changes Sarah had noticed earlier became more pronounced. The engine sound developed a rhythmic variation that set her on edge. She closed her laptop and listened carefully, her trained ear analyzing each nuance of the aircraft's performance. The irregularity was definitely getting worse. Captain Johnson felt it too. In the cockpit, warning lights began flickering intermittently on the engine monitoring display. The readings would spike briefly into yellow zones before returning to normal, creating a pattern that concerned both pilots. Martinez ran through the emergency checklist while Johnson maintained steady control of the aircraft. Flight 847, this is Denver Center, crackled through the radio. We're showing some unusual telemetry from your aircraft. Please confirm your status, Johnson keyed the microphone. Denver Center, Flight 847. We're experiencing some intermittent engine parameter fluctuations. Currently investigating. All systems appear stable at this time. Sarah heard the captain's announcement to passengers about minor technical adjustments, delivered in the calm, reassuring tone pilots use to avoid panic. But she recognized the careful word choices and knew something more serious was developing. Her military experience had taught her to read between the lines of official communications. The young mother across the aisle finally got her baby to sleep and looked relieved. Harold continued reading his war memoir, occasionally sharing interesting passages with Sarah. The businessman was still frustrated about his internet connection, completely unaware that connectivity problems might soon become the least of everyone's concerns. In the cockpit, the situation escalated. Engine number 2 suddenly showed a significant drop in oil pressure, followed by a temperature spike that triggered multiple warning alarms. Martinez quickly silenced the audio alerts while Johnson began the emergency procedure for engine shutdown. This was no longer a minor technical issue. We need to shut down Engine 2, Johnson announced to Martinez. Begin the single-engine approach procedures. Sarah felt the change immediately. The aircraft's vibration pattern shifted, and the slight yaw to the right told her they had lost an engine. Her pulse quickened, but her training kicked in automatically. She began mentally reviewing single-engine emergency procedures, even though she was just a passenger. The flight attendants received word from the cockpit about the engine shutdown. Jennifer, the senior attendant, quickly briefed her crew on emergency preparations while maintaining a calm exterior for the passengers. They would need to prepare for a possible emergency landing, but first they had to get everyone ready without causing panic. Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom again, this time with more gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced a mechanical issue with one of our engines and have shut it down as a precautionary measure. The aircraft is designed to fly safely on one engine, and we're diverting to Kansas City for an early landing. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. The mood in the cabin shifted instantly. Conversation stopped and passengers looked around nervously. The businessman forgot about his internet problems. Harold closed his book and looked concerned. The young mother woke up, sensing the tension even before fully understanding what was happening. Sarah remained calm, her military training helping her process the situation objectively. Single-engine approaches were challenging but routine for experienced pilots. However, she noticed something in the captain's voice that suggested there might be more problems than he was sharing publicly. Flight attendants began their emergency preparations, demonstrating safety procedures and checking that all passengers were properly secured. Jennifer moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, but Sarah could see the concern in her eyes. The crew was preparing for something more serious than a routine precautionary landing. "Ma'am," Jennifer said, stopping at Sarah's row, "I need to ask all passengers to review the safety card and prepare for a possible emergency landing. Do you have any medical training or aviation experience?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided honesty was important. "I have extensive aviation experience from my military service. I'm also trained in emergency medical procedures." Jennifer's eyes lit up with relief. "Could you please come with me? The captain might want to speak with you." As Sarah followed Jennifer toward the front of the plane, she noticed other passengers watching with growing anxiety. Harold gave her an encouraging nod, somehow sensing she might be able to help. The young mother clutched her baby more tightly, fear evident in her expression. In the cockpit, the situation had deteriorated further. The remaining engine was now showing irregular readings, and hydraulic system pressure was dropping. Captain Johnson was sweating despite the cool cabin temperature, and Martinez was rapidly running through emergency checklists, his earlier confidence replaced by intense concentration. "We've got multiple system failures," Johnson muttered to Martinez. "Engine 2 is completely dead. Engine 1 is running rough and we're losing hydraulic pressure. This is turning into a real emergency." Jennifer knocked on the cockpit door. "Captain, I have a passenger with military aviation experience. She might be able to assist?" Johnson looked back at Jennifer with surprise. In his 20 years of flying, he had never needed passenger assistance, but their situation was becoming desperate. "Send her in." Sarah entered the cramped cockpit and immediately assessed the instrument panel. Warning lights painted the dashboard in reds and yellows, and the engine readings confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just a single-engine situation anymore. They were dealing with cascading system failures that could quickly become catastrophic. "What's your background?" Johnson asked curtly, his hands busy with emergency procedures. "Sarah Mitchell, former Air Force, 10 years flying and maintaining military aircraft, including emergency situations in combat zones. I've handled multiple system failures before." Johnson and Martinez exchanged glances. Their training had prepared them for emergencies, but Sarah's experience in actual crisis situations might be exactly what they needed. The aircraft shuddered as the remaining engine coughed, sending new waves of concern through the cockpit. "The remaining engine is showing signs of failure," Martinez reported, his voice tight with stress. "If we lose it completely, we'll be dealing with a total engine-out emergency." Sarah studied the instruments carefully, her mind racing through possible solutions. She had faced similar situations in military aircraft, where system redundancy was often less reliable than civilian planes. Her experience might be the difference between a successful emergency landing and a disaster. The radio crackled with urgent communications from air traffic control, offering vectors to Kansas City and emergency services preparation. But Sarah could see from the engine readings that they might not have enough time to reach Kansas City safely. Critical decisions would need to be made soon, and the pilots were clearly struggling with the complexity of the multiple failures. The remaining engine suddenly lurched and lost significant power, sending vibrations throughout the aircraft. Captain Johnson gripped the controls tighter as the plane began losing altitude. Martinez frantically worked through emergency procedures, but the cascading failures were overwhelming their normal protocols. "Engine 1 is failing," Martinez announced, his voice strained. "Oil pressure dropping rapidly, temperature climbing beyond safe limits." Sarah stepped closer to the instrument panel, her military training automatically analyzing the situation. "Captain, with respect, you're going to lose that engine within minutes. We need to find the nearest airport immediately and begin total engine-out procedures." Johnson looked at her with a mixture of desperation and hope. His 20 years of commercial flying had never prepared him for a complete double-engine failure. "The nearest airport is still 40 minutes away. Can this aircraft glide that far?" Sarah quickly calculated in her head, considering the aircraft's weight, altitude, and glide ratio. "Not likely. We need options closer than Kansas City." What about smaller airports or emergency strips? Martinez was already scanning his navigation charts. There's a regional airport about 15 minutes ahead, but the runway might be too short for a Boeing 737. Better than trying to glide 40 minutes, Sarah replied firmly. What's the runway length? 5,000 feet, Martinez answered after checking his charts. Sarah nodded. Tight but possible with full emergency procedures. We'll need maximum braking and reverse thrust if we can get the engines restarted on touchdown. Captain Johnson felt overwhelmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation. His hands were shaking slightly and sweat dripped down his forehead. The responsibility for 147 passengers weighed heavily on his mind, and the multiple system failures were beyond anything in his experience. I've never attempted a dead-stick landing in a commercial aircraft, Johnson admitted quietly. This is outside my training. Sarah looked at both pilots with understanding. Captain, I've done emergency landings in military aircraft with similar weights and worse conditions. Would you like me to assist with the approach? The cockpit fell silent except for the groaning of the failing engine and the urgent beeping of warning systems. Johnson faced the most difficult decision of his career. Accepting help from a passenger violated every protocol he knew, but the alternative might be catastrophic. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers were becoming increasingly aware that something serious was wrong. The plane was losing altitude noticeably, and the engine noise had become irregular and frightening. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing everyone for emergency landing procedures. Harold, the Korean War veteran, recognized the signs of crisis from his military experience. He began helping other passengers stay calm, sharing reassuring words while internally preparing for the worst. The young mother was crying silently, holding her baby close and whispering prayers. Jennifer announced over the cabin speakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing technical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing at a regional airport. Please follow all crew instructions carefully and remain calm." The businessman who had been complaining about internet connectivity was now pale with fear, finally understanding that his problems had suddenly become much more serious. Other passengers began making phone calls trying to reach loved ones before they lost signal or before something worse happened. Back in the cockpit, the second engine finally gave up completely. Warning alarms filled the air as both engines shut down, leaving the aircraft in an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of wind rushing past the windows. They were now flying a 737 as a glider, with limited time to reach safety. Total engine failure, Martinez announced unnecessarily, as all three could see the engine indicators showing zero power. Sarah immediately took charge of the situation. "Captain, may I suggest we work together on this approach? I'll call out procedures while you maintain control. Martinez, I need you to handle all emergency communications and prepare the cabin." Johnson nodded, recognizing that Sarah's confidence and experience might be their only hope. "What do you need from me?" "First, establish best glide speed. We need to maximize our range while maintaining control authority. Martinez, contact the regional airport and declare a full emergency. Tell them we need every emergency vehicle they have and foam on the runway if available." Sarah's calm demeanor and clear instructions had an immediate effect on both pilots. Johnson felt his panic subsiding as he focused on specific tasks. Martinez began coordinating with air traffic control and emergency services. "Regional airport, this is Flight 847, declaring emergency. We have total engine failure and are attempting dead-stick landing on your field. Request all emergency equipment and runway foam if available." The small regional airport, normally handling only light aircraft and cargo planes, suddenly faced the biggest emergency in its history. Air traffic controllers scrambled to clear all other aircraft and activate emergency protocols they had never used for such a large commercial plane. Sarah continued directing the approach. "We're at 12,000 feet with about 8 minutes of glide time. The airport is 7 miles ahead. We need to manage our energy perfectly. Too high and we overshoot, too low and we come up short." Johnson followed her guidance, adjusting the aircraft's pitch and speed according to her calculations. His years of experience kicked in as he focused on the mechanical aspects of flying, rather than the fear of the situation. The plane descended steadily toward the small regional airport, visible now in the distance. Emergency vehicles were racing toward the runway, and Sarah could see foam being deployed to reduce fire risk during landing. The runway looked impossibly short from their altitude, but it was their only chance. 10 minutes to touchdown, Sarah announced. "Captain, you're doing great. Martinez, make sure the cabin is secured for impact. We're going to make this work. For the first time since the crisis began, Johnson felt a glimmer of hope. Sarah's military experience and calm leadership were giving them a fighting chance. But the most challenging part was still ahead, as they approached the runway that would determine whether 147 people would survive this emergency. As the aircraft descended through 6,000 feet, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The approach angle was too steep. At their current rate of descent, they would either overshoot the short runway or come in too fast for a safe landing on the abbreviated strip. "Captain, we need to adjust our approach," Sarah said firmly. "We're coming in too steep and fast for that runway length." Johnson was struggling with the unfamiliar sensation of flying a commercial airliner without engine power. The flight controls felt different, heavier, and less responsive than he was accustomed to. His normal approach techniques weren't working in this powerless glide. "I'm having trouble controlling the descent rate," Johnson admitted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Without engine power, the aircraft doesn't respond the way I'm used to." Sarah studied the situation quickly. In her military experience, she had dealt with similar emergencies where pilots became overwhelmed by unfamiliar conditions. Sometimes the best solution was to have the most experienced person take direct control, regardless of normal protocols. "Captain, would you be willing to let me take the controls? I've done several dead-stick landings in similar conditions." The request hung in the air of the cockpit like an impossible proposition. In the history of commercial aviation, passengers simply didn't fly aircraft during emergencies. But Johnson could see they were running out of options, and his own skills weren't sufficient for their desperate situation. Martinez looked between Sarah and Johnson, understanding the gravity of the moment. "Captain, whatever we decide, we need to decide now. We're at 4,000 feet. Johnson made the hardest decision of his flying career. Take the controls, Sarah. But I'm staying right here to assist however you need." Sarah slid into the captain's seat and immediately felt the aircraft's behavior through the controls. The Boeing 737 was much heavier than the military aircraft she was used to, but the principles of emergency flying remained the same. She began adjusting their approach path, using techniques she had learned in combat situations. "Martinez, announce to the cabin that we're beginning our final approach. Tell everyone to assume crash positions and that we'll be on the ground in 3 minutes." In the passenger cabin, Jennifer and her crew were preparing everyone for the emergency landing. Passengers were coached on proper crash positions, seatbelts were checked and tightened, and emergency exits were identified for different sections of the plane. Harold, the Korean War veteran, helped calm the passengers around him. "I've been through worse situations than this," he told the frightened young mother. "That woman who went to the cockpit knows what she's doing. We're going to be fine." The businessman had stopped worrying about his internet connection and was now helping other passengers prepare for the landing. Crisis had a way of changing people's priorities quickly, and he found himself thinking about his family instead of his missed video conference. Sarah aligned the aircraft with the small runway, visible now as a narrow strip surrounded by open fields. The regional airport's emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, their lights flashing in preparation for the incoming emergency. 3,000 feet, Martinez called out, monitoring their altitude. "Runway in sight, emergency vehicles standing by." Sarah calculated their approach speed and descent rate, making small adjustments to keep them on the optimal glide path. The aircraft was responding well to her control inputs, but she knew the real challenge would come during the actual touchdown and stopping sequence. 2,000 feet. Speed 140 knots, descent rate steady. Johnson watched Sarah's technique with amazement. Her movements were precise and confident, showing no signs of the panic he had felt earlier. She was treating this emergency like a routine training exercise, which somehow made him feel more confident about their chances. Regional Airport, Flight 847 on final approach. Request confirmation that runway is clear and emergency equipment is ready. Flight 847, runway is clear, foam deployed. All emergency vehicles standing by. Wind is calm, cleared to land. Sarah smiled grimly at the radio call. Cleared to land seemed like an understatement for their situation, but she appreciated the air traffic controller's professional calm during their crisis. 1,000 feet, Martinez announced. Looking good, Sarah. The runway was getting larger in the windscreen, but Sarah could see how short it really was. Most commercial aircraft used runways twice this length. and they would be landing without any engine power to help with reverse thrust. Everything would depend on the brakes and her ability to touch down precisely at the runway's beginning. Sarah keyed the intercom to address the passengers directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah from the cockpit. We're about to touch down on a short runway. The landing may feel firm, and there will be maximum braking immediately afterward. Stay in your crash positions until we come to a complete stop." Her calm, authoritative voice over the intercom had an immediate effect on the passengers. Instead of the captain's voice, they were hearing from someone who sounded completely in control of the situation. Many passengers felt their anxiety decrease slightly. 500 feet, Martinez called. "Perfect approach angle, Sarah." Sarah could see individual emergency vehicles now, positioned along the runway ready to respond if anything went wrong during the landing or stopping sequence. The foam on the runway reflected the afternoon sunlight, creating a white carpet that would help prevent fires if they had any fuel leaks. Johnson remained ready to assist but was impressed by Sarah's handling of the approach. She was flying the Boeing 737 like she had been doing it for years, making subtle adjustments that kept them perfectly aligned with the runway center line. 200 feet. Speed on target, rate of descent good. The ground was rushing up toward them now, and Sarah prepared for the most critical part of the emergency. She had successfully completed the approach phase, but landing and stopping on the short runway would require perfect timing and maximum use of every available braking system. 100 feet. Touchdown in 10 seconds, Martinez announced as Sarah prepared to find out if her military training would be enough to save 147 lives in the next few crucial moments. Sarah held her breath as the Boeing 737's wheels touched the runway with a firm thud that shook the entire aircraft. The moment of contact sent vibrations through the plane, but she had achieved exactly what she wanted. Touchdown right at the beginning of the short runway with minimal floating. "Touchdown," Martinez called out as Sarah immediately deployed the spoilers and began maximum braking procedures. The aircraft's weight pressed down on the landing gear as Sarah applied steady, firm pressure to the brake pedals, without engine reverse thrust to help slow them down. Everything depended on the wheel brakes and the deployed spoilers reducing lift over the wings. In the passenger cabin, people felt the firm landing and the immediate deceleration as maximum braking began. The young mother held her baby tightly, feeling the aircraft slow dramatically. Harold gripped his armrests, his military experience telling him they were doing everything right to stop safely. "Brakes holding," Johnson announced, monitoring the brake temperature gauges that were climbing rapidly under the extreme demands being placed on them. Sarah could feel the aircraft responding to her control inputs, but the end of the runway was approaching faster than she would have liked. The Boeing 737 was a heavy aircraft, and even maximum braking took significant distance to overcome the momentum of their landing speed. Emergency vehicles began following the aircraft down the runway, ready to respond if the brakes failed, or if they overran into the grass beyond the pavement. The foam on the runway helped reduce the risk of fire, but everyone watching held their breath as the plane continued its braking sequence. "Half runway remaining," Martinez announced, watching their position markers. Sarah increased the brake pressure slightly, pushing the system to its limits without causing the wheels to lock up and skid. Her military training had taught her to find the maximum braking efficiency without losing control, a skill that was proving crucial in their emergency. The aircraft's speed continued dropping, but Sarah could see they were going to use every foot of the available runway. The end of the pavement was clearly visible ahead, with open grass field beyond where no aircraft should ever go. "Quarter runway remaining," Martinez called out, his voice tense. Sarah made a split-second decision and pulled the emergency brake handle, applying maximum stopping power even at the risk of blowing the tires. The aircraft shuddered under the extreme braking forces, and passengers felt themselves pressed forward against their seatbelts. Jennifer and the other flight attendants braced themselves as the aircraft continued its dramatic deceleration. They could feel they were slowing rapidly, but the sensation of extreme braking was intense enough to frighten passengers who weren't prepared for such forces. 50 feet from runway end, Martinez announced. The aircraft's brakes were performing perfectly under the extreme demands, and Sarah could feel they were going to stop in time. The end of the runway was approaching, but their speed had dropped low enough that they would stop with room to spare. With a final shudder, the Boeing 737 came to a complete stop about 20 feet from the end of the runway. Emergency vehicles immediately surrounded the aircraft, their crews ready to handle any problems with fuel leaks, fires, or passenger injuries. The cockpit fell silent except for the cooling sounds of the aircraft and the distant noise of emergency vehicles. Sarah, Johnson, and Martinez sat quietly for a moment, processing what they had just accomplished together. "We did it," Johnson said quietly, amazement in his voice. "We actually did it." Sarah keyed the intercom to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground and stopped. Please remain seated until the flight crew gives you instructions to evacuate. Emergency crews are checking the aircraft now." The passenger cabin erupted in spontaneous applause and cheering. People were crying with relief, hugging strangers and thanking each other for helping during the crisis. The young mother was sobbing with joy while her baby, somehow, slept peacefully through the entire celebration. Harold looked around at the other passengers with satisfaction. He had known from his military experience that they had competent leadership handling their emergency, and his confidence had helped keep others calm during the critical moments. Emergency crews completed their inspection of the aircraft and found no fuel leaks, fires, or structural damage that would prevent a normal evacuation. The pilots had successfully landed the aircraft with no engines and stopped it safely on a runway that was barely long enough for their needs. "All passengers and crew, this is your captain," Johnson announced over the intercom. "We will be evacuating through normal doors rather than emergency slides. Please wait for crew instructions and help each other as we exit the aircraft." Sarah remained in the cockpit as passengers began their orderly evacuation. She felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline that followed successful emergency operations. Johnson and Martinez were completing their post-landing checklists, though many of the procedures didn't apply to their unusual situation. "Sarah," Johnson said, "I need to ask you something. What made you so confident you could land this aircraft?" Sarah smiled. "Honestly, Captain, I wasn't completely confident, but I've learned that in emergencies, acting with confidence is often more important than feeling confident. The aircraft doesn't know if you're scared. It only responds to your control inputs." Martinez shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like that approach and landing. You flew that Boeing like you'd been doing it for years." "The principles are the same across different aircraft," Sarah explained. "Emergency procedures, energy management, and precision flying translate between platforms. My military training included scenarios like this one. Outside the aircraft, emergency crews were helping passengers exit and checking everyone for injuries. News crews were arriving at the small regional airport, drawn by reports of the emergency landing. The story was already spreading that a passenger had helped land the commercial aircraft. As Sarah prepared to leave the cockpit, she reflected on how quickly circumstances could change. Hours earlier, she had been a routine passenger planning to review technical reports during a normal flight. Now she had helped save 147 lives using skills she never expected to need in civilian life. The successful emergency landing would soon make headlines around the world, but for now, Sarah was simply relieved that everyone was safe and looking forward to calling her sister to let her know the flight had arrived safely, though not quite as planned. As passengers filed off the aircraft, word spread quickly among them about who had actually landed their plane. The young mother stopped to thank Sarah personally, tears streaming down her face as she held her baby. "I heard from the flight attendant that you saved us all," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing me home to see my husband again." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the gratitude but tried to remain modest. "The pilots did the real work. I just helped with some procedures I was familiar with from my military background." Harold, the Korean War veteran, approached Sarah with a knowing smile. "I figured you had some serious training when you stayed so calm during the emergency. What branch of service?" "Air Force," Sarah replied. 10 years working with aircraft systems and emergency procedures." "Well, you sure put that training to good use today," Harold said, shaking her hand firmly. "Those pilots made the right choice asking for your help." The businessman who had been complaining about internet connectivity approached Sarah hesitantly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I was being difficult about trivial things while you were prepared to handle a real crisis. Thank you for what you did." News crews had arrived at the small regional airport and were interviewing passengers about their experience. When they learned that a passenger had helped land the aircraft, reporters immediately began searching for Sarah to get her side of the story. Captain Johnson emerged from the cockpit looking exhausted, but relieved. He sought out Sarah before speaking with investigators or media representatives. When he found her helping an elderly passenger with her luggage, he waited patiently for her to finish. "Sarah, I need to speak with you privately before the investigators arrive," Johnson said seriously. They found a quiet corner of the small terminal building, away from the crowds of passengers, emergency personnel, and gathering media. Johnson looked at Sarah with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with professional concern. "What we did in that cockpit goes against every protocol in commercial aviation," Johnson began. "Passengers don't fly airplanes during emergencies. But you saved 147 lives today, including mine." Sarah nodded, understanding his concern. "I realized the situation was highly irregular, Captain. I was prepared to accept whatever consequences came from violating normal procedures." "There won't be any consequences," Johnson said firmly. "I'm going to tell the investigators exactly what happened and why I made the decision to accept your help. You had the skills we needed, and you used them to save lives." Federal Aviation Administration investigators arrived at the airport within hours of the emergency landing. They began interviewing the flight crew, passengers, and ground personnel to understand exactly what had occurred during the flight and emergency landing. The lead investigator, a veteran FAA official named Robert Chen, had seen many aircraft emergencies during his career, but never one involving passenger participation in actually flying the aircraft. He approached the investigation with careful attention to both the technical aspects and the human factors involved. "Captain Johnson," Chen began during his interview, "walk me through your decision-making process when you allowed the passenger to take control of the aircraft." Johnson explained the cascade of system failures, the deteriorating flight conditions, and his recognition that Sarah's experience exceeded his own in the specific type of emergency they were facing. He emphasized that the decision was made based purely on maximizing the chances of survival for everyone aboard. When Chen interviewed Sarah, he was impressed by her technical knowledge and calm demeanor. Her description of the emergency procedures and landing technique demonstrated expertise that few people possessed outside of professional aviation. "Ms. Mitchell, in your opinion, what would have happened if you hadn't assisted with the landing?" Chen asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I believe Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez would have continued doing their best with the situation. Whether that would have been sufficient for a successful outcome, I can't say, but I do know that our combined skills gave us the best possible chance." Martinez's interview corroborated the accounts given by both Johnson and Sarah. He described the progressive equipment failures and the desperate nature of their situation when Sarah offered to help. His technical logs and radio communications provided objective evidence of the timeline and severity of their emergency. Passengers were also interviewed about their experience, and many specifically mentioned Sarah's calm announcements and confident handling of the situation. Their accounts painted a picture of someone who had taken charge during a crisis and inspired confidence in others. The FAA investigation would take several weeks to complete, but preliminary findings indicated that all procedures had been followed correctly, given the extraordinary circumstances. The investigators noted that Sarah's intervention had likely prevented a catastrophic accident. Media attention intensified as news of the story spread. Major networks wanted to interview Sarah about her role in the emergency landing, and aviation experts began discussing the implications of civilian expertise being used during commercial flight emergencies. Sarah found herself uncomfortable with the attention but recognized the importance of sharing lessons from the experience. She agreed to limited interviews, focusing on the teamwork between herself and the professional flight crew, rather than her individual contributions. "The real heroes are Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez," Sarah told one reporter. "They faced an impossible situation and made the difficult decision to accept help from someone with different but relevant experience. That takes courage and good judgment." The airline issued a statement praising all three members of the flight crew for their professional response to the emergency and thanking Sarah for her assistance. They announced that both pilots would receive additional training in extreme emergency procedures. Aircraft manufacturers began reviewing the incident to understand how multiple system failures had occurred and whether design changes might prevent similar situations in the future. Sarah's technical input was valuable in helping engineers understand how the failures had progressed and how crews might better respond. As the immediate crisis faded and official investigations proceeded, Sarah began to process the full impact of what had happened. She had used her military training to help save civilian lives, bridging the gap between her past career and her current life in an unexpected and dramatic way. 6 months after the emergency landing, Sarah's life had changed in ways she never expected. The FAA investigation concluded that her actions had prevented a catastrophic accident, and she received commendations from both military and civilian aviation organizations. But the most meaningful changes were personal ones. The young mother from the flight, Maria Santos, had kept in touch with Sarah. They met for coffee regularly, and Maria's baby had taken his first steps in Sarah's living room. The bond formed during those terrifying moments in the air had developed into a genuine friendship. "I think about that day every time I see a plane overhead," Maria told Sarah during one of their visits. "But instead of being afraid, I think about how competent people like you are out there, ready to help when things go wrong." Harold, the Korean War veteran, had become something of a mentor to Sarah. His perspective on using military skills to help civilians resonated deeply with her ongoing transition from military to civilian life. They often discussed how military training could be applied to peacetime challenges. "You showed me something important that day," Harold told Sarah. "Military experience doesn't have to be left behind when you take off the uniform. Those skills can serve people in ways you never expect." Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez had both undergone additional training and returned to flying. Johnson, in particular, had been profoundly affected by the experience and had become an advocate for improved emergency training that included scenarios involving passenger expertise. "That day taught me that good leadership sometimes means recognizing when someone else has better skills for the situation," Johnson explained during a safety conference. "Pride and protocol matter, but not more than the lives of the people depending on you." The airline industry had taken notice of the incident and begun reviewing policies about passenger assistance during emergencies. While the circumstances of Sarah's involvement were highly unusual, aviation experts recognized that civilian expertise might occasionally be available and valuable during crises. Sarah had been offered several positions with airlines and aircraft manufacturers, all eager to benefit from her unique experience. She chose to work as a safety consultant, helping develop training programs that better prepared crews for extreme emergencies like the one they had faced together. Her new role allowed her to travel to aviation training centers around the world, sharing the lessons learned from Flight 847's emergency landing. Pilots appreciated her practical approach to emergency procedures and her emphasis on teamwork during crisis situations. The businessman from the flight had also stayed in contact with Sarah. His experience during the emergency had prompted him to reevaluate his priorities, and he had begun volunteering with organizations that provided assistance to military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. "You reminded me that there are people dealing with real problems while I was worried about trivial things," he told Sarah. "I wanted to find a way to help others the way you helped all of us." Sarah's sister had been terrified when she learned about the emergency landing through news reports, but she was also proud of how Sarah had used her military training to help civilians. The incident had strengthened their relationship and helped Sarah's family understand the value of her military experience. The small regional airport where they had made their emergency landing had become a point of pride for the local community. They installed a small plaque commemorating the successful emergency landing and the cooperation between military and civilian aviation professionals. Aviation museums began requesting artifacts from Flight 847, and Sarah eventually donated her military flight logs and emergency procedure manuals to a museum dedicated to aviation safety. She hoped they might inspire other veterans to consider how their skills could serve civilian communities. Sarah often reflected on the random circumstances that had placed her on that particular flight at that particular time. If she had chosen a different seat, if the flight attendant hadn't asked about aviation experience, if Captain Johnson hadn't been willing to accept help, the outcome might have been very different. The experience had taught her that military skills and civilian needs could intersect in unexpected ways. Her years of training for combat situations had prepared her to help save civilian lives during a peacetime emergency, bridging two worlds she had thought were separate. Speaking at a veterans transition workshop, Sarah encouraged others to recognize the civilian applications of their military expertise. You never know when your training might be exactly what someone needs, she told the audience. Stay ready to help even when you're not in uniform anymore. The incident had also influenced her personal relationships. She had begun dating a fellow veteran who worked as an emergency medical technician, someone who understood both her military background and her commitment to helping others during crises. Sarah still flew regularly for her consulting work, but she always introduced herself to the flight crew and let them know about her aviation background. Several times, pilots had asked for her insights on weather conditions or aircraft performance, though none had faced emergencies requiring her direct assistance. The story of Flight 847 had become a case study in aviation schools and military training programs, illustrating the importance of teamwork, leadership under pressure, and making difficult decisions during emergencies. Sarah occasionally lectured at these institutions, emphasizing the human factors that had made their success possible. As she looked back on that day, Sarah realized it had marked a turning point in her transition from military to civilian life. Instead of leaving her military identity behind, she had found a way to integrate it into her new life, using her training to serve others in unexpected but meaningful ways. The passengers from Flight 847 had scattered across the country, returning to their normal lives, but they carried with them a shared experience of crisis and survival. For Sarah, they had become an extended family of sorts, connected by those crucial moments when ordinary people had worked together to overcome an extraordinary challenge. She kept in touch with many of them through social media and holiday cards, maintaining connections forged during their most vulnerable moments. Their ongoing friendships reminded her that military service's true value lay not just in combat effectiveness, but in the ability to help others when they needed it most.